President Donald Trump issued a direct warning that the United States is prepared to impose severe financial sanctions that could further damage Russia's already struggling economy. Putin made it clear that while he does not outright reject the idea of halting military operations, any deal must lead to long-term stability rather than just a temporary pause in fighting. He believes that without addressing what he calls the root causes of the war, any truce would simply delay further conflict. This includes discussions on Ukraine's NATO aspirations and territorial disputes that have fueled the war since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. The Kremlin's stance suggests that while Russia might consider the ceasefire, it wants modifications before agreeing to it. On the American side, Trump has taken a firm stance. He emphasized that if Russia does not accept the ceasefire, the U.S. will respond with severe economic consequences. Trump has hinted that Washington has financial tools at its disposal that could be devastating for Moscow, though he insists that his ultimate goal is peace rather than economic warfare. The possibility of new sanctions has raised concerns among Russian officials, as existing restrictions have already placed significant pressure on the country's economy. Despite these developments, the Kremlin's official response remains cautious. Putin has not outright rejected the ceasefire, but has stopped short of fully committing to it. His latest public appearance was particularly noteworthy. For the first time in a long while, the Russian leader was seen wearing a military uniform during a visit to a command center near Ukraine. Analysts have interpreted this as a symbolic gesture, reinforcing his image as a wartime leader while signaling strength to both domestic and international audiences. During his visit, Putin suggested the creation of a buffer zone along the Russian-Ukrainian border. This proposal, if implemented, would establish a demilitarized area separating Russian and Ukrainian forces, reducing the chances of direct confrontations. While this might be seen as a step toward de-escalation, Ukraine is unlikely to accept such a move without strong security guarantees, as it could effectively freeze the conflict on Russia's terms. Meanwhile, tensions between Washington and Moscow continue to rise. The U.S. has maintained that any ceasefire agreement must be fair to Ukraine and not simply serve as an opportunity for Russia to regroup. American officials have pointed to past ceasefire violations by Russia, expressing skepticism about Putin's willingness to honor such an agreement. This concern is shared by Ukrainian leaders, who fear that Moscow may use a temporary truce to reinforce its military positions before launching further attacks. At the same time, there are growing signs that Russia's position is not as strong as it once was. Reports suggest that internal divisions within the Kremlin are becoming more apparent, with some Russian elites privately expressing frustration over the war's economic toll. The financial strain is evident, and while Russia has managed to sustain its military campaign so far, the long-term sustainability of the war remains in question. This is why some believe Putin may be open to negotiations, not necessarily to end the war, but to buy time and ease economic pressure. For Ukraine, the stakes are incredibly high. Kyiv has accepted the U.S.-brokered 30-day ceasefire proposal, putting the spotlight on Moscow's response. Ukrainian officials have made it clear that while they are willing to explore diplomatic solutions, they remain wary of any agreement that does not include strong security assurances. Past experiences have shown that Russia often uses diplomatic pauses to its advantage, making it difficult for Ukraine to trust any deal without concrete guarantees. While Trump's ultimatum has increased pressure on the Kremlin, it is unclear whether this will be enough to push Putin toward an agreement. Historically, the Russian leader has been strategic in his approach, often waiting for geopolitical shifts that could work in his favor. However, the reality on the ground is that Russia's war effort has become increasingly costly, and with Western sanctions tightening, Putin may have fewer options than before. The war in Ukraine continues to shift, with both military and economic forces shaping the battlefield. While diplomatic discussions over a ceasefire are ongoing, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Russia's military operations remain active, and U.S. financial pressure is intensifying in an effort to push Moscow into accepting a truce. The question now is whether these combined forces will be enough to alter the course of the conflict. On the military front, Russian state media recently confirmed that President Vladimir Putin made a rare visit to the Kursk region, an area near the border with Ukraine. The visit was highly symbolic, as it marked one of the few times Putin has stepped so close to the active combat zone since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. While there, he instructed Russian troops to push Ukrainian forces back, reinforcing his commitment to continued military operations. His presence served as both a morale booster for Russian soldiers and a clear message to the international community that he is still in control of the situation. Russian forces, backed by both local and foreign allies, have recently made advances in certain regions, particularly near the contested areas of eastern Ukraine. Reports indicate that North Korean troops have been deployed alongside Russian units, assisting in regaining control of certain villages. While North Korea's official involvement has been downplayed, intelligence reports suggest that Pyongyang has been supplying military assistance to Moscow in various forms, including weapons and manpower. This development has raised concerns among Western nations, as it signals that Russia is finding alternative sources of support to sustain its war effort. Meanwhile, Ukraine has not remained idle. With continued backing from Western allies, Kyiv has been reinforcing its positions and preparing for potential escalations. Ukrainian officials have emphasized the importance of continued military aid, stating that without it, their ability to defend against Russian offensives would be significantly weakened. U.S. President Donald Trump has already made it clear that if Putin rejects the proposed ceasefire, the United States will continue to supply Ukraine with advanced weaponry. Recent reports confirm that American military shipments have been arriving through Poland's Rzeszów-Jastrzębie logistics hub, a key transit point for Western arms headed to Ukraine. These shipments include artillery, tanks, air defense systems, and long-range missiles, critical assets for Kyiv's defensive strategy. While military operations continue on the battlefield, economic pressure is mounting in parallel. Sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies have already hit Russia's economy hard, but Washington is now preparing even tougher measures should Putin refuse the ceasefire. The Russian economy, which has managed to remain somewhat stable despite sanctions, is showing signs of strain. Moscow has been forced to adapt by finding alternative trade partners, increasing domestic production, and shifting its financial transactions away from Western banking systems. However, these workarounds have limitations, and the cumulative effects of sanctions are beginning to take their toll. One of the most significant areas of economic pressure is Russia's energy sector. The country remains one of the world's largest oil producers, but Western sanctions have made it increasingly difficult for Moscow to sell its oil and gas at profitable rates. The U.S. and its partners have imposed price caps on Russian crude oil exports, limiting the revenue Moscow can generate from its most valuable commodity. As a result, Russia has been forced to sell oil at discounted rates to countries like China and India. Even though these sales provide some financial relief, they are not enough to fully offset the losses caused by sanctions. Additional financial restrictions have targeted Russia's banking system, further complicating its ability to conduct international transactions. The Biden administration previously implemented a 60-day exemption, allowing certain energy-related transactions involving Russian banks to continue, but that exemption has now expired. With its removal, major Russian financial institutions, including Sberbank, VTB Bank, and Alfa Bank, face further difficulties in accessing the global financial system. This decision is expected to further limit Russia's ability to engage in trade, particularly in energy markets, where transactions often require access to Western financial infrastructure. The tightening of sanctions has also affected Russia's trade surplus. In 2022, during the first year of the war, Russia's trade surplus was an estimated $337 billion. However, by 2024, that number had dropped significantly to just $51 billion. The dramatic reduction reflects the increasing difficulty Moscow faces in selling its exports while also dealing with rising costs due to sanctions on its financial and transportation sectors. The effects of these restrictions have been compounded by logistical challenges, with Russian companies struggling to find shipping partners willing to transport sanctioned goods. Despite these economic setbacks, Russia has continued to allocate a significant portion of its national budget to military spending. Recent estimates suggest that war-related expenditures now consume nearly 40% of Russia's budget, a figure that has alarmed both economic analysts and some members of Russia's political elite. The prolonged conflict has led to high inflation, rising interest rates, and an overall stagnation of economic growth. While Moscow has managed to maintain a degree of stability by redirecting resources, the long-term sustainability of this approach remains in question. For Ukraine, financial assistance from Western nations has played a crucial role in maintaining its war effort. The US and its allies have provided not only military aid, but also direct financial support to keep Ukraine's economy afloat. In recent months, discussions have intensified over additional economic assistance, with the European Union and the United States debating new financial packages aimed at sustaining Ukraine's government and rebuilding war-damaged infrastructure. Kyiv has emphasized that without continued Western support, its ability to resist Russian aggression would be significantly weakened. At the same time, there is growing pressure within the US and Europe to ensure that aid to Ukraine is being used effectively. Some policymakers have called for stricter oversight of financial assistance, arguing that accountability measures must be in place to prevent misuse of funds. This debate has led to discussions on how future aid packages should be structured, balancing the need to support Ukraine with concerns over financial transparency. While Western nations continue to back Ukraine, they also recognize that a prolonged war could have economic consequences for their own economies. Rising energy prices, increased defense spending, and disruptions in global trade have already created challenges for many countries. The longer the war continues, the greater the strain on global markets, making the prospect of a ceasefire an attractive option for many world leaders. The financial burden of the war is becoming increasingly unsustainable for Russia. At the start of the invasion, Moscow was able to rely on its vast oil and gas revenues to keep its war machine running. However, after multiple rounds of sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies, those revenues have been significantly reduced. The West's strategy has been clear from the start: limit Russia's ability to finance its war by targeting its most important economic assets. Over the past 2 years, these sanctions have affected everything from Russian oil exports to its access to international banking systems. In 2022, Russia had a trade surplus of $337 billion, but by the end of 2024, that number had fallen dramatically to just $51 billion. This sharp decline is a direct result of restrictions on Russian oil exports and the freezing of Russian financial assets abroad. Additionally, many European nations that once relied on Russian energy have shifted to alternative suppliers, further limiting Moscow's ability to generate revenue. While Russia has found some buyers in China and India, these deals often require selling oil at steep discounts, meaning the profits are far lower than before. Inflation and high interest rates have also made life more difficult for ordinary Russians. The war has driven up prices on essential goods, making it harder for people to afford basic necessities. The ruble, which once remained relatively stable, has lost value against major currencies, affecting both businesses and consumers. With the cost of living rising, discontent among Russian citizens is growing, even if public dissent remains tightly controlled by the government. Despite these economic difficulties, Putin has continued to allocate a massive portion of the national budget to military spending. It is estimated that around 40% of Russia's budget is now directed toward funding the war effort. This includes everything from producing new weapons to paying soldiers and mercenaries. While the Kremlin has managed to keep the war going through financial maneuvering, experts warn that this level of spending is unsustainable in the long run. If the conflict continues without a resolution, Russia could face deeper economic troubles that would make it increasingly difficult to maintain its military operations. The Russian elite is also beginning to show signs of frustration. For years, Putin has relied on a network of oligarchs and powerful businessmen to maintain his grip on power. However, the war has disrupted their businesses and made it harder for them to operate internationally. Many of Russia's wealthiest individuals have seen their assets frozen in Western countries, making it difficult for them to access their fortunes. Travel bans have also prevented them from moving freely, a stark contrast to the days when they could enjoy luxury lifestyles abroad. While most of these figures have remained loyal to Putin, there are growing indications that some are questioning the long-term impact of the war on Russia's economy and their own financial interests. At the same time, there is concern about Russia's ability to sustain its manpower in the war. Since the invasion began, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been sent to Ukraine, with many never returning. The high casualty rate has forced the Kremlin to implement recruitment drives, including offering financial incentives to attract new soldiers. However, reports indicate that enthusiasm for joining the military is declining. Many Russian men are wary of being sent to fight in Ukraine, especially given the brutal conditions on the battlefield. There have also been reports of Russian soldiers deserting or refusing to follow orders, further highlighting morale issues within the military. Putin may view a ceasefire as an opportunity to regroup rather than an end to the war. In previous conflicts, Russia has used temporary pauses in fighting to reorganize its forces and strengthen its position before launching new offensives. If a ceasefire is agreed upon, it could allow Russia to replenish its military supplies and reinforce its defensive lines. This would give the Kremlin time to reassess its strategy without the immediate pressure of ongoing combat. However, accepting a ceasefire would also be an admission that the war has not gone according to plan. Putin initially expected a quick victory in Ukraine, but after more than 2 years of fighting, Russian forces have failed to achieve their main objectives. While they have gained some territory, they have also suffered significant losses. A ceasefire could be seen as a way for Russia to save face while avoiding further military setbacks, but it would not necessarily mean the end of the conflict. Another challenge for Putin is maintaining his image as a strong leader. Throughout his presidency, he has cultivated an image of power and control, portraying himself as a leader who stands up to the West. Agreeing to a ceasefire under pressure from the United States could be seen as a sign of weakness, something he has always sought to avoid. Russian state media has worked hard to shape the narrative around the war, presenting it as a necessary fight against Western aggression. If Putin agrees to a ceasefire, he will need to carefully manage the messaging to ensure that it is framed as a strategic decision rather than a retreat. For the United States, the goal remains clear: force Russia to make concessions through a combination of military support for Ukraine and economic pressure on Moscow. Trump's warning about new sanctions is a reminder that Washington is prepared to increase the cost of war for Russia if it refuses to engage in negotiations. The current sanctions have already placed significant strain on the Russian economy, but there is room for further measures. The US and its allies could impose even stricter financial restrictions, making it even harder for Russia to conduct international transactions. They could also tighten restrictions on technology exports, further limiting Russia's ability to produce advanced weapons. While some in the international community hope that a ceasefire could lead to a broader peace agreement, there is widespread skepticism. Ukraine remains cautious about any deal that does not include strong security guarantees. Kyiv has repeatedly stated that it will not agree to any deal that allows Russia to maintain control over occupied Ukrainian territory. Additionally, past ceasefires have often been short-lived, with fighting resuming shortly after agreements were reached. Ukrainian officials fear that if Russia is given time to regroup, it could use the ceasefire to launch a renewed offensive later. As the possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine continues to be discussed, one of the biggest questions is how the Ukrainian people and government will respond to any deal that might be reached. While international pressure is mounting for a pause in fighting, many in Ukraine remain skeptical about whether such an agreement would truly bring peace or simply allow Russia time to regroup for further attacks. Public opinion has shifted throughout the war, but one thing remains clear: most Ukrainians do not trust Russia's intentions, and any deal that compromises their country's sovereignty will face significant resistance. Over the past 2 years, Ukrainian society has endured enormous hardship. The war has displaced millions, devastated cities, and led to widespread loss of life. A survey conducted in late 2024 found that nearly 90% of Ukrainians had experienced some form of stress related to the war, with many facing displacement, losing family members, or enduring relentless bombings. The ongoing trauma has fueled strong emotions about how the conflict should end. While some are open to negotiations, the majority still believe that Ukraine should fight until its territorial integrity is fully restored. Polling data suggests that while support for a negotiated settlement has increased, there is still deep concern over what any ceasefire would mean for Ukraine's future. In a Gallup poll conducted in December 2024, 52% of Ukrainians said they supported starting negotiations to end the war as soon as possible, while 38% favored continuing the fight until Ukraine achieved total victory. However, when asked about territorial concessions, a large majority opposed giving up any land to Russia. This suggests that while war fatigue is growing, most Ukrainians are unwilling to accept an agreement that legitimizes Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory. President Volodymyr Zelensky's position on the ceasefire will be crucial in shaping public acceptance of any agreement. His approval ratings have fluctuated throughout the war, but recent polls show that his support has rebounded, particularly after facing criticism from some U.S. officials. Many Ukrainians still see him as the leader who has kept their country together during its darkest times. However, if he agrees to a ceasefire that is seen as too favorable to Russia, it could damage his credibility and spark political turmoil. Some opposition figures have already warned that accepting a weak deal could be politically dangerous for him. Another major concern is whether a ceasefire would actually hold. Ukraine has been in this situation before, with past ceasefires breaking down after Russia used the pause to strengthen its military position. Many Ukrainians believe that without ironclad security guarantees, any truce would simply be a temporary break in the fighting. That is why Kyiv continues to push for stronger support from NATO and other Western allies, hoping that external security guarantees will prevent Russia from exploiting a ceasefire to launch future offensives. Beyond public opinion and military strategy, Ukraine also faces economic challenges that make the war increasingly difficult to sustain. The country has relied heavily on Western financial aid to keep its government running and its economy afloat. The destruction of infrastructure, declining industrial output, and ongoing war expenses have taken a toll, making long-term financial support essential. If Western nations begin to reduce their aid, Ukraine may face growing pressure to negotiate a settlement, even if it is not in line with its original goals. For now, the decision on whether to accept a ceasefire is in Russia's hands, but Ukraine will play a major role in determining whether any agreement can last. If Putin accepts a temporary truce, it will be up to Kyiv and its allies to ensure that it does not become another opportunity for Russia to rebuild and launch new attacks. The outcome of these negotiations will shape the future of Ukraine, as well as the broader geopolitical landscape. The world is watching closely, but for Ukrainians, the stakes could not be higher.